Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material.
Right, and we're so glad you're joining us for this.
Yeah, absolutely. So to kick this deep dive off, I want you to imagine something. Imagine inheriting a corporation, okay? But the former CEO didn't just, mismanage the funds.
Oh, it's so much worse than that.
Way worse. He literally boarded up the doors to the main factory. He destroyed the core product, alienated every single ally, and actively cultivated this deeply toxic, predatory culture.
Yeah, just a complete teardown.
Exactly. And you, as the new leader, are 25 years old.
Just a kid, really.
Right. The organization is bankrupt in every conceivable way, surrounded by hostile competitors, ready for a hostile takeover. So what do you do on day one?
It's the ultimate leadership test.
It really is. Today, we're exploring the ultimate behavioral study in systemic collapse and radical reform. We're diving into the ancient texts of 2 Chronicles, specifically chapters 29 through 36.
And this isn't just dusty history, you know. We're looking at a period of intense volatility in the ancient nation of Judah.
A total roller coaster.
Exactly. It spans multiple generations and features some of the most dramatic ideological shifts recorded in ancient literature.
And to really unpack the mechanics behind these events, we're using a few different sources, right?
Yeah, we are. We're utilizing the historical text of 2 Chronicles itself, obviously, but we're pairing that with the rigorous analytical commentary of 2 classic scholars, Matthew Henry and Albert Barnes.
Those guys bring so much depth to this.
They really do. Their work helps us bridge the gap between ancient geopolitical maneuvering and the actual psychological realities of the figures involved.
Okay, let's unpack this. We begin with King Hezekiah in chapter 29.
Right.
And to understand Hezekiah, we really have to look at the wreckage he inherited from his father, King Ahaz.
Ahaz he wasn't just an ineffective ruler.
No, not at all.
He instituted a total dismantling of Judah's cultural and spiritual identity, basically to appease the surrounding superpowers. Specifically, the Assyrians' Ahaz adopted their religious practices.
Which is just wild to think about. He took the sacred vessels out of the temple in Jerusalem, cut them in pieces, and then...
The worst part.
Yeah, in a move of profound symbolic violence, he literally nailed the doors of the temple shut.
Nailing the doors shut was the ultimate declaration of cultural surrender.
Just giving up completely.
Yeah. By closing the temple, Ahaz deactivated the central nervous system of the Jewish people.
Wow. Deactivated the central nervous system.
Right, because Albert Barnes points out in his commentary that the lamps were extinguished, the daily burning of incense ceased.
And these weren't just religious rituals, right?
No, not at all. They were the daily rhythms that oriented the society. They marked time. They defined their shared covenantal identity.
And Ahaz replaced all that centralized, unifying worship with decentralized high places in every corner of Jerusalem.
Yeah, and we should probably define that term because high places comes up constantly in this text.
Good call. When we read high places, we aren't just talking about altitude, right?
Right, exactly. These were unsanctioned pagan altars built on hillsides. Ahaz was essentially franchising idol worship.
Franchising idol worship. That's such a good way to put it.
Yeah, he made it so people didn't have to engage with the demanding, centralized ethics of the temple. They could just participate in localized, highly syncretic, often transactional worship of foreign deities.
He fragmented the culture to make it more digestible to their Assyrian overlords.
Completely. And Matthew Henry's commentary captures the profound psychological toll this must have taken on Hezekiah.
Because Hezekiah lived through all this.
He did. He lived through his father's reign. As a young prince, he had to stand by and watch the systematic desecration of his own heritage.
That's heartbreaking.
He saw the priests dismissed. He saw the filth accumulate in the sanctuary. He watched the nation become fractured, vulnerable, and spiritually bankrupt.
So, Hezekiah takes the throne at 25. And the text tells us that in the very first month of his reign, he doesn't call his generals to bolster the military defense against Assyria.
Right.
He doesn't convene an economic council to address the plundered treasury. He goes straight to the temple, opens the doors, and orders the priests and Levites to begin cleaning.
The timeline is the critical mechanism here. He doesn't wait for optimal geopolitical conditions. He attacks the core rot immediately.
Day one.
Day one. He gathers the Levites, who were the traditional caretakers of the temple that his father had marginalized, and tells them to sanctify themselves and carry forth the filthiness out of the holy place.
And Barnes notes a fascinating logistical detail here, doesn't he?
He does. Hezekiah orders them to clean the inner part first.
Which is such a profound principle for organizational turnaround. Like a bad leader taking over that situation might say, let's clean the front steps and paint the exterior walls so the public sees a quick win.
Right, the optics.
Exactly, focus on optics. But Hezekiah forces them to start in the darkest, most inaccessible part of the building, the inner sanctuary.
Because treating the symptom doesn't cure the disease. And the priests take this directive so seriously that the cleansing operation takes 16 straight days.
16 days of just hauling out garbage.
Literally. They are hauling decades of accumulated physical and spiritual refuse out to the brook Kidron.
And we should explain the brook Kidron because it sounds picturesque, right? Like a lovely little stream.
Right, like a babbling brook.
But in ancient Jerusalem, it was essentially the topographical dumping ground.
A landfill.
Yeah, a valley outside the city walls used to dispose of cursed or unclean items. They were taking the toxic remnants of Ahaz's regime and physically removing them from the sacred precinct.
And that physical labor, it mirrors the psychological work of systemic reform. The ancient text speaks frequently of ritual impurity, right?
Which for them meant what exactly?
Well, it involved literal altars, blood sacrifices, ceremonial washing. But the enduring behavioral insight here is that neglecting our core values creates a buildup of psychological and ethical filth.
Oh, that's heavy. So when an institution or an individual abandons its foundational principles, the internal rot just accumulates.
Exactly. It accumulates until the doors of your operational capacity just shut. Like, what doors in your own life have you shut? What fundamental practices have you neglected because you've been too busy surviving?
And the action step here is that Hezekiah didn't wait. He did the cleanup now.
Right, immediately.
So once the temple is clean and the sacrificial system is restored, Hezekiah does something that completely disrupts the political status quo.
Oh, this part is brilliant.
He decides to hold a massive Passover celebration. But he doesn't just invite the citizens of his own southern kingdom of Judah.
Nope.
He writes letters and sends runners deep into the northern kingdom of Israel to tribes like Ephraim, Manasseh, and Zebulun.
And to grasp the audacity of this, we really have to look at the political landscape.
Set the scene for us.
The northern kingdom of Israel had violently seceded from the southern kingdom of Judah centuries prior, right after the reign of King Solomon.
So there's centuries of bad blood.
Centuries, border skirmishes, deep theological division. Furthermore, the northern kingdom was currently buckling under the crushing weight of Assyrian invasions.
They were in crisis mode.
Total crisis. So by sending these letters, Hezekiah is transcending centuries of entrenched political borders. He is offering a path back to a shared foundational identity.
He sends these runners with a message that essentially says, do not be stiff-necked like your ancestors. Yield yourselves to the sanctuary.
Right.
I find the response to these letters endlessly fascinating because it is so true to human nature. The text says the couriers passed from city to city, but the people laughed them to scorn and mocked them.
Yeah, cynicism is the default defense mechanism of a deeply entrenched, failing system.
Wow, say that again. Cynicism is the default defense mechanism.
Yeah, of a failing system. The people in the north had been living under idolatrous, corrupt kings for generations.
Right.
Their immediate reaction to a genuine invitation to reform is derision, because accepting the invitation would require them to admit their current way of life was bankrupt.
And mockery is much easier than repentance.
5%.
Yet the text notes a critical exception. A remnant, certain individuals from Asher, Manasseh, and Zebulun humbled themselves and came to Jerusalem.
Just a few.
Yeah, just a humble few. Hezekiah couldn't control the macro response of the rival nation, but his willingness to extend the invitation provided an exit strategy for the few who were ready to change.
Matthew Henry emphasizes this exact dynamic. He notes that the yielding of the heart is a profound act of humility.
Because they had a lot to lose.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The people who accepted the invitation had to leave their homes, cross a hostile border, and submit to the leadership of a rival king in Jerusalem.
So the practical reflection for anyone trying to shift a culture is understanding that you must send the invitations, but you have to be prepared for the mockery.
You're going to get mocked.
Your job is just to secure the perimeter for the remnant who actually want to heal.
That's perfectly said.
So this massive 16-day inner cleanup and the resulting Passover celebration represents a monumental internal success. You would naturally expect that this level of sweeping righteous reform would be rewarded with an era of uninterrupted peace.
You think so?
Right. But instead, this brings us directly into the events of chapter 32, where Hezekiah faces the ultimate external threat.
The ambush.
Exactly. Fixing your internal culture doesn't prevent external crises. It simply fortifies you to survive them.
And the external threat here is Sennacherib, the terrifying king of Assyria. The Assyrian Empire was the apex predator of the ancient Near East.
Apex predators is the right term. They were brutal.
Completely brutal. They had just finished completely obliterating the northern kingdom of Israel, wiping them off the map and deporting the population.
Just erase them.
Gone. Sennacherib was a conqueror intent on universal dominion. And to provide a sense of global historical timing here, Matthew Henry's commentary points out something fascinating.
Oh, I love this part.
Right around the time Sennacherib is marching his massive army toward Jerusalem, a city called Rome was being founded by Romulus on the Italian peninsula.
That puts the timeline into such sharp perspective. Rome is just a fledgling little dirt settlement, while Assyria is this highly sophisticated, unstoppable war machine.
Exactly.
So Sennacherib camps against the fortified cities of Judah and sets his sights on Jerusalem. And his tactics go far beyond standard siege warfare, like battering rams and starvation.
Yeah.
He deploys incredibly sophisticated psychological warfare.
He really does. He sends his top officials, including a figure titled the Rabshakeh, to the walls of Jerusalem.
Okay.
But instead of requesting a private diplomatic parley with Hezekiah's generals, which is what you'd expect, the Assyrian officials stand outside the city walls and shout their demands directly to the populace.
Over the heads of the leaders.
Yes, and they do it in Hebrew.
The text highlights that specific detail. They cried with a loud voice in the Jews' speech unto the people that were on the wall.
So calculated.
The goal is to bypass the chain of command, incite a panic, and provoke a mutiny from within. And the arguments they make are just a masterclass in gaslighting and theological deconstruction.
Sennacherib's officials attack the very core of what Hezekiah had just spent years rebuilding. They asked the people, "Whereon do ye trust, that ye abide in the siege in Jerusalem?"
Right.
They systematically list all the other nations Assyria has destroyed. They argue, did the gods of those nations deliver them out of our hand? No. So what makes you think the God of Hezekiah will deliver you?
Which is terrifying logic if you're standing on that wall.
It's paralyzing. They are weaponizing Hezekiah's reforms against him. They're essentially arguing that by centralizing worship and destroying the localized high places, Hezekiah has actually angered the gods and left the city defenseless.
Wow. So Hezekiah's response to this terrifying psychological assault is brilliant, but it initially looks contradictory to a modern reader.
How so?
Well, on one hand, he gathers his military captains in the square and delivers this soaring, deeply spiritual speech. He tells them, "Be strong and courageous, be not afraid, for there be more with us than with him. With him is an arm of flesh, but with us is the Lord our God to help us and to fight our battles."
A statement of radical dependence.
Absolute radical dependence on divine intervention.
Right.
But simultaneously, he is executing one of the most ambitious defensive engineering projects in ancient history.
Right. He doesn't just pray.
Exactly. He takes counsel with his princes and frantically orders his men to stop the water supply from the springs outside the city. He reroutes the Gihon Spring through a massive underground tunnel, which, by the way, archaeologists have actually excavated and verified.
It's still there.
It's still there. He brings the water safely inside the city walls while dehydrating the approaching Assyrian army. He rebuilds the broken sections of the city wall, raises it up to the towers, builds a second outer wall, mass-produces shields and weapons.
He's busy.
Very busy. So my question is, isn't it a bit contradictory? Is he trusting God to fight the battle? Or is he trusting his own hydrology engineering and weapons manufacturing?
What's fascinating here is that to the ancient mind, and particularly to the author of Chronicles, those two actions are completely synergistic.
Okay, unpack that.
Matthew Henry provides a crucial theological framework here. He notes that those who trust God must still use proper means. Otherwise, they're tempting him, not trusting him.
Oh, wow. Tempting him, not trusting him. That completely reorients the definition of faith.
Doesn't it? True faith in this context is not passive fatalism. Faith is the catalyst for extreme preparation.
Right.
Hezekiah's spiritual conviction that God was with them is precisely what gave him the psychological clarity to make ruthless, brilliant, tactical decisions.
Because if he had panicked.
If he had succumbed to the panic Sennacherib was trying to induce, he never would have possessed the presence of mind to execute the complex rerouting of the water system.
That makes so much sense. His practical engineering was the physical manifestation of his spiritual defiance.
Exactly. So he prepares the city. He famously goes into the temple to pray alongside the prophet Isaiah, and then the narrative reaches its climax.
And the resolution of the Assyrian siege is a moment that many modern readers might struggle with. It's a significant obstacle to growth for some, because it involves a staggering display of violent divine intervention.
It's very abrupt.
It really is. The text records that an angel of the Lord goes into the Assyrian camp and wipes out 185,000 soldiers, including all the mighty men of valor, the leaders, and the captains, in a single night.
And Sennacherib wakes up to a decimated army. He is forced to return to his own land with, as the text says, shame of face, where he is ultimately assassinated by his own sons in the temple of his pagan god.
Which is quite the ironic end.
Very. And modern audiences are naturally uncomfortable with this kind of abrupt, absolute devastation. But the theological claim the author is making centers on the limits of human arrogance.
Because Sennacherib positioned himself not just as a king, but as an unstoppable deity.
Right. He openly mocked the creator of the universe and tortured entire populations. The author is demonstrating that ultimate deliverance often arrives through avenues entirely outside human control.
To humble the pride of empires.
Precisely. Hezekiah did everything within his power. He built the walls and secured the water. But the ultimate salvation of the city was utterly out of his hands.
The survival of Jerusalem wasn't a testament to his engineering. It was a testament to his humility in recognizing his limitations.
Yes.
Which makes the very next event in Hezekiah's life so profoundly ironic. It's what we might call the ambush of success.
The ambush of success. I love that phrasing.
Hezekiah survives this apocalyptic siege. Shortly after he contracts a terminal illness, he prays, and God miraculously heals him, extending his life by 15 years.
An incredible turnaround.
Right. So Hezekiah is now at the absolute zenith of his power, his wealth, and his spiritual prestige. And that is exactly when his character fractures.
Ambassadors arrive from Babylon. Yeah. At this point in history, Babylon is a rising power, but not yet the world-dominating empire that will eventually destroy Jerusalem. The Babylonian envoys ostensibly come to congratulate Hezekiah on his recovery and to inquire about the astronomical wonder that occurred.
And Hezekiah takes the bait. Instead of attributing his survival and healing to God, he takes them on a grand tour of his own greatness.
He shows off.
He opens up his armory, his treasury, his storehouses. He shows them his silver, his gold, his spices, his precious ointments.
Yeah.
He makes the entire interaction an exhibition of his own self-sufficiency.
And the text delivers a chilling summary of this moment. God left him to try him, that he might know all that was in his heart.
That is sobering.
Isn't it? When the crushing pressure of the Assyrian army was at the gates, Hezekiah's faith was diamond hard. He knew he was dependent.
Right.
But the moment the pressure evaporated, replaced by the flattery of foreign diplomats and the comfort of immense wealth, his internal architecture collapsed. He fell into profound pride.
Behavioral psychology tells us that success is frequently more dangerous to our character than suffering.
Absolutely.
Suffering violently forces us to acknowledge our limits and dependencies. Success, however, whispers the insidious lie that we are the sole architects of our own salvation.
It really does.
So the practical reflection here is evaluating how you handle the lifting of pressure. Like, do you know what is truly governing your heart when the pressure is off? When everything is going your way, when the bank account is full and people are flattering your accomplishments?
It's a tough question, and Hezekiah does eventually humble himself for the pride of his heart, and the judgment is delayed. But his momentary lapse in judgment casts a terrifyingly long shadow over the next generation.
Because that wealth he showed off.
The wealth he proudly displayed to the Babylonians would eventually become the very prize the Babylonian Empire returns to conquer.
Wow. And this transition from Hezekiah's subtle pride to the blatant, horrifying rebellion of his son is one of the most jarring whiplash moments in the entire historical record.
It gives you whiplash, for sure.
We move into chapter 33, and we meet Manasseh. If Hezekiah's story is about the blueprint for turnaround, Manasseh's story is about the absolute rock-bottom extremes of the human condition.
Manasseh ascends to the throne as a child of 12.
12.
12 years old. He reigns for 55 years, making it the longest reign of any king in the history of Judah. And he utilizes those 5.5 decades to systematically, surgically obliterate every single reform his father instituted.
He doesn't just drift into bad policy. He aggressively reconstructs the infrastructure of idolatry.
Yeah, he rebuilds the high places, he rears up altars for Baalim and makes groves.
But he goes so much further than his grandfather Ahaz ever did. We have to examine the specific horrors the text lists to understand the depth of this cultural plunge.
It's dark. Manasseh takes a carved image, an idol, and installs it directly inside the temple of God.
The very inner sanctuary his father spent 16 days purifying.
Exactly. He actively engages in the occult, dealing with familiar spirits, wizards, and necromancers. He observes times and uses enchantments. He is essentially institutionalizing dark arts and pagan mysticism at the highest levels of government.
And then there's the most incomprehensible detail. He causes his own children to pass through the fire in the valley of the son of Hinnom.
The cult of Molech.
Yes, we are talking about actual child sacrifice. He is burning his own offspring to appease foreign deities. It is the absolute destruction of every moral, ethical, and theological boundary. He weaponizes his power to terrorize his own family and his nation.
And the political motivations behind this are likely tied to Assyrian vassalage.
Really? How so?
Well, to maintain his long rule and avoid the fate of the nations around him, Manasseh likely felt compelled to aggressively assimilate into the religious and cultural practices of the dominant Assyrian Empire.
Ah, I see.
But the text frames it as a deep personal rebellion. He made the inhabitants of Judah to err and to do worse than the heathen nations that God had previously destroyed.
He outpaganized the pagans.
He really did.
But the natural consequences of this behavior eventually catch up with him. The Lord brings upon them the captains of the host of the king of Assyria, and the description of Manasseh's capture is visceral.
It is. Albert Barnes notes the translation of the Hebrew here. Manasseh is taken among the thorns, or with hooks.
With hooks?
Yes. This aligns perfectly with historical Assyrian bas-reliefs, which depict conquered kings being led away with actual bronze rings pierced through their lips or noses.
Oh my goodness. That's horrifying.
He is bound in heavy bronze fetters and dragged to a dungeon in Babylon.
So the king who fancied himself a master of the dark arts and a god among men is reduced to an animal on a leash, rotting in a foreign prison.
Exactly.
But the narrative doesn't end with his execution. Here's where it gets really interesting, because we encounter the most scandalous plot twist in the text.
Scandalous is the right word.
Manasseh is sitting in this Babylonian dungeon. He has lost his kingdom, his dignity, his freedom. And the text says that in his affliction, he besought the Lord his God and humbled himself greatly before the God of his fathers.
He prays.
He prays. And God actually listens to his entreaty, hears his supplication, and miraculously orchestrates his release and return to the throne in Jerusalem.
It is a staggering narrative pivot, and it deeply offends our modern sensibilities regarding retributive justice.
Wait a minute, let me push back hard on this.
Yeah.
This guy burns his children alive, destroys the national culture, institutionalizes the occult, and he just hits rock bottom, says, I'm sorry, in a dungeon, and gets his kingdom back.
Right.
How does that not offend our modern sense of justice? Where is the accountability? Why does God restore a monster?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the frustration is entirely justified if we view justice strictly as a transactional scale of karma. But the biblical narrative is operating on a different framework, the framework of covenantal grace. The author is making an incredibly radical, uncomfortable theological claim. No human being, regardless of the depth of their depravity, is beyond redemption if the humility and repentance are absolute.
That is a tough pill to swallow.
It is. But Matthew Henry points out that Manasseh's affliction in the dungeon finally forced him to bethink himself. The hooks in his flesh proved definitively that his false gods were powerless and that he was not in control.
So it wasn't just a fake apology.
No, his humility wasn't a strategic PR move. It was the desperate realization of his own utter bankruptcy.
The text says that Manasseh knew that the Lord, he was God. It took the loss of everything to shatter his 55 years of delusion.
Yes.
But I think it's crucial to point out that the text is brutally realistic about the aftermath. Forgiveness is not a time machine.
Precisely. Manasseh experiences profound personal grace. He returns to Jerusalem, and he genuinely tries to undo his own damage. He takes the strange gods and the idol out of the house of the Lord. He repairs the altar and commands Judah to serve the God of Israel. But he cannot put the genie back in the bottle.
The collateral damage is permanent. The text includes a devastating caveat. Nevertheless, the people did sacrifice still in the high places.
Right.
Manasseh changed his own heart, but the culture he had spent 5 decades polluting was irreparably poisoned.
He could remove the idol from the temple, but he couldn't remove the idolatry from the hearts of the people he had trained to rebel.
So the practical application here requires holding 2 truths in tension.
What are they?
First, combating the myth of being too far gone. Whether it's addiction, ruined relationships, or ethical failures, the path back always begins with radical, dungeon-level humility. Grace is always available.
Always.
But second, recognizing that personal forgiveness does not erase the collateral damage you've inflicted on your family, your employees, or your society.
Manasseh's story really forces us to look at the warning signs in our own systems. In behavioral psychology, we talk about ignoring negative feedback loops until a catastrophic failure forces a reset.
Right.
Manasseh required the catastrophic reset, the dungeon and the fetters, to finally pay attention.
So the strategic advantage of studying this ancient text is learning to course correct at the thorn stage, long before you reach the dungeon stage. Acknowledge the thorns in your life before you're dragged away.
Exactly. And that collateral damage becomes immediately apparent the moment Manasseh dies.
Right, because his son takes over.
Yes, his son Amon takes the throne at 22. Amon replicates the profound wickedness of his father's early years, but he utterly refuses to replicate his father's repentance.
He humbles not himself.
Right. His reign is a brief, violent disaster, ending in his assassination by his own servants after just 2 years.
Which leaves the nation in the hands of an 8-year-old boy named Josiah.
8 years old.
This moves us into chapter 34. We shift from top-down cultural destruction to the power of rediscovering foundational truth. And Josiah is arguably the most fascinating reformer in the book because he doesn't have the luxury of a righteous mentor.
No, he's raised in the toxic aftermath of Amon and Manasseh.
Yet the timeline of Josiah's spiritual development is incredibly deliberate. At age 16, he begins to actively seek after God. By 20, he initiates a sweeping purge of the idols, the groves, and the carved images throughout Judah, and even up into the ruined territories of the north.
He's ambitious.
Very. And by 26, he commissions a massive project to repair the structural damage to the temple.
And it is during these architectural repairs that one of the most pivotal moments in biblical history occurs.
The finding of the book.
Yes. Hilkiah the high priest is sorting through the debris, organizing the silver brought into the house of God, and he stumbles upon a dusty, forgotten scroll.
Just lying there.
It is the book of the law of the Lord given by Moses. Most scholars agree this was a copy of the book of Deuteronomy, or perhaps the entire Torah.
Which is, how do you lose the most important book of your religion inside the temple itself?
It's hard to fathom.
That's like a massive tech company losing its original source code in the server room. They kept the architecture of the institution, but they entirely lost the operating manual.
Well, institutional drift happens incrementally. During the dark decades of Manasseh and Amon, the temple was either co-opted for pagan rituals or completely neglected.
So the scrolls were probably hidden.
Likely hidden away by faithful priests to protect them from Manasseh's purges, and then simply forgotten as the generations turned over. The people were living in a society that had completely lost its memory of who it was supposed to be.
So they bring this recovered scroll to King Josiah, and Shaphan the scribe reads it aloud to him. Josiah's reaction is visceral and immediate.
He doesn't just treat it as a neat historical artifact.
Right. He doesn't say, oh, look, first edition Moses, let's put it in a museum. As soon as he hears the words of the law, he physically tears his clothes in grief.
Tearing the garments is the ancient Near Eastern expression of overwhelming mourning and terror.
Because he realizes the trouble they're in.
Instantly. He realizes that the scroll isn't just history. It is a covenantal contract that his nation has violently breached. He hears the curses and judgments outlined in Deuteronomy for idolatry and rebellion, and he realizes that the wrath of God is currently hovering over his generation.
He immediately sends a delegation to consult a prophetess named Huldah, and Huldah delivers a message that is both terrifyingly definitive, profoundly merciful.
A real mixed bag.
Yeah, she confirms the diagnosis. Disaster is inevitable for the nation. The cultural rot is too deep, the idolatry too entrenched. The judgment written in the book will fall upon the place and its inhabitants.
But then Huldah delivers a specific message directly to Josiah.
What does she say?
She says, "Because thine heart was tender, and thou didst humble thyself before God, when thou heardest his words, I have even heard thee also." She promises that he will be gathered to his grave in peace, and his eyes will not see the evil that is coming.
Because thine heart was tender. That phrase is the crux of Josiah's leadership, isn't it?
Absolutely.
He was strong enough to execute ruthless political purges, strong enough to smash stone idols to dust, but his internal posture was so soft that he wept over the reading of a scroll. He possessed a tender heart in a brutalized world.
It is the ultimate paradox of transformative leadership. Unyielding, courageous conviction regarding objective truth, perfectly married to deep personal humility and self-awareness.
He doesn't use the book to condemn others. He allows the book to condemn him first.
That's a great distinction.
Upon hearing this, Josiah goes all in. He gathers all the elders of Judah, goes up to the temple with all the people, great and small, and he stands in his place and reads the entire book in their ears. He makes a solemn public covenant to walk after the Lord and keep his testimonies with all his heart.
And he compels everyone present to stand to it.
Which leads directly into chapter 35, where Josiah orchestrates the most magnificent Passover celebration since the days of the prophet Samuel.
The logistics of this event are staggering.
The text is incredibly specific about the organization. Josiah sets the priests in their charges, addresses the Levites, tells them to put the Holy Ark in the house. He organizes the courses of the priests according to the writing of David and Solomon.
He's getting it all perfectly aligned.
And then he personally donates from his own substance 30,000 lambs and kids and 3,000 bullocks just so the common people can participate.
His princes follow suit, donating thousands more. The Levites are described as flaying the offerings, roasting the Passover with fire according to the ordinance, boiling the other holy offerings, distributing them speedily.
It's a massive operation.
It is. The singers, the sons of Asaph, are in their place. It is a massive, highly coordinated, joyous return to the ancient rhythms of grace and redemption.
It's a breathtaking logistical and spiritual triumph. But as we read this, we have to ask the difficult question. Is it actually working?
Right.
Is this massive top-down reform actually changing the DNA of the nation?
This is where Matthew Henry's commentary provides a sobering, necessary layer of wisdom and discernment.
What does he say?
He says that Josiah was entirely sincere. He was a reformer of the highest caliber, driven by a genuinely tender heart. But the reality on the ground was far more cynical.
Really?
Yeah. Henry points out that while the king was on fire, the populace was merely complying with a royal edict. They followed feignedly.
Feignedly? They were just going through the motions because the guy with the army told them to?
Exactly. You can force compliance, but you cannot legislate the heart.
Wow. You can force compliance, but you cannot legislate the heart.
Josiah could fund the Passover, he could organize the Levites, he could physically tear down the altars of Baal, and he could read the words of the covenant, but he could not force the people to actually love the God of the covenant.
The internal transformation of a society cannot be mandated from the throne.
As soon as the external forceful pressure of Josiah's leadership is removed, the people will instantly snap back to their baseline desires.
Which is a terrifying reality check for any leader, parent, or influencer today. You can build all the correct structures, you can enforce the rules, you can create a flawless corporate culture on paper. But if the internal desire of the people isn't actually engaged, it's just a temporary suppression of the rot.
So the practical question for the listener is twofold.
Okay, let's hear it.
First, regarding your own life. Have you lost your source code? Have you become so adept at maintaining the external architecture of your life, your career progression, your social image, your daily routines, that your foundational operating manual is gathering dust in the background?
That's a great question. And the second?
Second, when you are confronted with that foundational truth, what is your reaction? Do you immediately calculate how it applies to others, or do you cultivate a tender heart that allows the truth to dismantle your own pride?
Because that tender heart is the only shield against what happens next. Which brings us to the devastating final section, chapter 36, the final collapse.
The collapse begins with a catastrophic geopolitical miscalculation.
By Josiah.
Yes. Josiah, despite all his spiritual wisdom, inserts himself into a massive military conflict between the Egyptian Empire under Pharaoh Necho and the rising Babylonian Empire.
He gets involved where he shouldn't.
Exactly. Josiah rides out to intercept the Egyptian army at the Valley of Megiddo. He disguises himself, ignoring warnings that this is not his fight, and he is struck by archers. He is brought back to Jerusalem, where he dies.
And the death of Josiah is the pulling of the linchpin. All that feigned compliance we talked about, it instantly evaporates.
It just vanishes.
The story accelerates with brutal rapidity toward its tragic, inevitable conclusion. We see a rapid-fire succession of 4 kings, and it reads like a spiral down a drain.
It is the death rattle of a nation.
Yeah.
First, the people make Josiah's son Jehoahaz king, but the king of Egypt deposes him after just 3 months, heavily taxing the land.
3 months.
Then the king of Egypt installs Jehoahaz's brother Eliakim, changing his name to Jehoiakim, as a puppet king. Jehoiakim rules wickedly for 11 years until Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, arrives and binds him in fetters.
The Babylonians have entered the chat.
Oh, yeah. Then Jehoiachin takes over for a mere 3 months and 10 days before he, too, is hauled off to Babylon.
Finally, Nebuchadnezzar installs Zedekiah. Zedekiah is the last king of Judah, and he really seals the fate of the nation. He doesn't just rebel politically, he commits a profound moral failure.
He breaks an oath.
Exactly. The text explicitly notes that Zedekiah rebelled against King Nebuchadnezzar, who had made him swear by God. Zedekiah broke a sacred covenantal oath. He stiffened his neck and hardened his heart from turning to the Lord God of Israel.
The leadership completely fractures, and the spiritual leadership, the chief of the priests, follows suit, transgressing very much after all the abominations of the heathen, polluting the house of the Lord in Jerusalem.
But the author of Chronicles identifies one specific ultimate sin that breaks the camel's back.
It isn't just the idolatry.
No, and it isn't just the broken oaths. The text says that the Lord God of their fathers sent to them by his messengers, rising up betimes and sending them, because he had compassion on his people and his dwelling place.
God is sending prophets, desperately trying to wave them off the cliff.
But the people's response is the final nail in the coffin. They mocked the messengers of God and despised his words and misused his prophets.
Yeah.
They didn't just ignore the warnings, they actively, violently ridiculed the mechanism of their own salvation.
And they did this, the text says, until the wrath of the Lord arose against his people, till there was no remedy.
So what does this all mean, till there was no remedy?
It is one of the most chilling phrases in ancient literature. It is a medical metaphor. It means the societal sickness had progressed past the point of a cure. The patient had rejected the medicine so aggressively and for so long that the condition was now terminal.
Wow.
The only remaining option was the death of the system.
So the Babylonians arrive in full force. The siege is horrific and absolute. They slaughter the young men with the sword in the sanctuary itself. They have no compassion on young man or maiden, old man, or him that stooped for age.
They take everything.
All the vessels of the house of God, the treasures of the king, they hauled them to Babylon.
And then they burn it to the ground.
The whole city.
Burn the house of God. The magnificent temple Solomon built, the temple Hezekiah so painstakingly scrubbed clean, the temple where Josiah found the lost book, it is reduced to ash.
Unbelievable.
They break down the walls of Jerusalem, burn all the palaces with fire, and destroy all the goodly vessels. The survivors who escape the sword are carried away captive to Babylon, where they become servants to the king and his sons.
It is the total annihilation of a society. The psychological weight of this, for the ancient reader, cannot be overstated. Everything that defined them is gone.
Gone entirely.
The question we have to grapple with is, how do we make sense of this total collapse? What is the overarching logic behind this devastation after centuries of chances, prophets, and reforms?
This raises an important question, and the author of Chronicles provides a profoundly specific theological and ecological summary at the end of the chapter to explain the logic of the exile.
What did she say?
The text states that the land lay desolate, and those who survived were kept in Babylon to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah until the land had enjoyed her Sabbaths. For as long as she lay desolate, she kept Sabbath, to fulfill 70 years.
The forced Sabbath. This is an incredibly deep concept that requires some unpacking.
It really does. In the ancient law of Moses, specifically in Leviticus, God instituted an agricultural and theological mandate. Every 7th year, the land itself was supposed to be given a Sabbath rest.
Farming.
Right. There was to be no planting, no pruning, no harvesting. It was designed as a profound trust exercise. The people had to trust that God would provide enough in the 6th year to sustain them through the 7th.
And it was an ecological necessity too, right?
Exactly, allowing the soil to replenish its nutrients.
But the kings and the people of Judah, driven by economic greed, the demand for constant production, and a fundamental lack of trust, had simply ignored this law for roughly 490 years.
Almost 5 centuries of ignoring the rules.
They refused to pause. They squeezed every ounce of productivity out of the dirt year after year, century after century.
So the divine logic of the exile is mathematically precise. God essentially says, you owe the land 70 years of rest. Since you refuse to give the land its Sabbath willingly, I am evicting you, and I will take it forcefully.
So the land gets its 70 years of rest all at once while the people sit in exile.
Exactly.
You know, the modern translation of this ancient agricultural law is overwhelmingly urgent for our current culture. We are obsessed with infinite extraction and endless production. We view rest as a weakness or a luxury.
We really do. Hustle culture.
But the principle of the forced Sabbath dictates that you cannot cheat the fundamental rhythms of life. If you refuse to take your required rest, if you refuse to pause, reflect, and realign, your body, your mind, or your circumstances will eventually force a Sabbath upon you.
Usually in the form of a catastrophic collapse.
Burnout.
It's the burnout that leaves you bedridden. It's the sudden hospitalization. It's the nervous breakdown or the sudden firing that forces you to stop. Your body, your mind, or your environment will eventually say, we are taking the rest you refuse to give us, and we are taking it now.
This concept forces us to reevaluate our definition of sustainability. We see this comparative insight playing out even on a macro global scale in the text. The rise of the Babylonian Empire to crush Judah, and then the subsequent fall of Babylon to the Persian Empire, mirrors the cyclical nature of human systems.
No human structure is permanent.
None. No matter how powerful, technologically advanced, or seemingly permanent, they all rise, extract resources, become proud, ignore the limits of reality, and inevitably fall.
Yet the author of Chronicles does not end this sprawling, tragic narrative in complete darkness. The book ends abruptly, almost surprisingly, with a glimmer of hope.
It jumps forward 70 years. The Babylonian Empire has been conquered. Cyrus, the king of Persia, issues a decree throughout all his kingdom.
A decree of freedom.
He declares that the Lord God of heaven has given him all the kingdoms of the earth and has charged him to build him a house in Jerusalem. Cyrus then issues a proclamation to the captive Jewish people. Who is there among you of all his people? The Lord his God be with him, and let him go up.
It is the permission to return. The 70 years of forced rest are complete. The debt is paid. The story ends not with final annihilation, but with the possibility of a new beginning.
A chance to rebuild.
A chance to rebuild the temple, to rebuild the walls, and, ideally, to rebuild a culture that finally understands the necessity of humility and rest.
This has been an incredible sweeping journey through a profoundly turbulent era of human history. We've looked at kings who built towering walls and kings who burned their own children. We've seen empires rise like unstoppable machines and crash into dust.
It's been a wild ride.
It has. The entire arc of these chapters shows us that while systems, nations, and companies will inevitably rise and fall, the posture of the individual heart, whether it is prideful like early Manasseh or tender like Josiah, is the only thing that truly echoes into eternity.
The only thing that lasts.
Which posture are you carrying today?
That is the question to ponder.
That's the heart of this section. This is Wisdom for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.